Hi, everyone. Welcome to another office-wide new grantee orientation webinar hosted by the Office on Violence Against Women. My name is Neelam Patel, team lead for training technical assistants. And today's presentation is from Activating Change, and our presenter is Sandra Harrell. And Activating Change is one of our comprehensive TA providers that has a resource center on serving the disability and deaf community. So I am now going to send this over to Sandra. Thank you all so much.
This is Sandra. Thank you so much, Neelam. Thank you so much, Mackenzie, and welcome everyone. Congratulations on your new award. As Neelam said, Activating Change runs the Disability Deaf Resource Center, which is a comprehensive technical assistance provider for the Office on Violence Against Women's grantees and any potential grantees. And through that resource center, we provide grantees with training and technical assistance around serving survivors with disabilities and deaf survivors. Today, I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about the experiences of survivors with disabilities and also some opportunities for you all to incorporate change strategies into your organizations and some of the resources that are available for you if you are inspired to do that after today's session. As well as at the end, I will drop a link in the chat so that you can request direct technical assistance. But we're going to get started, really just getting us all on the same page around understanding disability. One of the things that we make a note of whenever we're talking about disability in our society is that disability is actually a really normal part of the human condition. If you live long enough, you will likely acquire age-related disabilities in your lifetime. You may experience temporary disabilities in your lifetime due to an accident. Many of you may have had congenital disabilities that you've had your entire life. But we as a society have tended to treat disability as something abnormal outside of the norm. But when in reality, it is, 1 in 5 to 1 in 4 people in the United States has a disability, depending on the definition of disability that you are using. If you're using the Americans with Disabilities Act definition, it's 1 in 5 people. So that's just 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The World Health Organization's definition, when applied, it's about 1 in 4 people. And disability is a very, very broad category as well. A lot of times we have been taught to think of disability as primarily physical disabilities, partially because the the icons that we use to mark something as being accessible usually has a person who's using a wheelchair. And so in our mind's eye, we might think of disability as primarily physical disabilities or sensory disabilities, because we will often see in our spaces American Sign Language interpreters or captioning, which will remind us, oh yeah, there are deaf people as well in the world. But in reality, as I mentioned, disability is much broader category, and it includes disabilities that impact a person's processing of information. These are called cognitive disabilities, and this can come in the form of something that is acquired through head injury. People who have traumatic brain injuries often experience cognitive disability as a result. Or it can also be congenital. It can be something that is present with you from birth. Oftentimes you begin to notice it once you become school aged and you realize that your ability to read is a little bit more challenged, and you might get diagnosed with dyslexia or ADHD. But regardless, it's a matter of, it's a disability that impacts your ability to process information. It doesn't necessarily mean that you cannot learn past a certain point. Those are intellectual disabilities. Intellectual disabilities impacts a person's ability to learn past a certain point. And these are often present at birth and then again identified once you go through the stages of development. You can acquire an intellectual disability again through head injury, which can make you lose a lot of what you've already learned, a lot of what you've already memorized, or impact your ability to create new memories. But for the vast majority of people with intellectual disabilities, these are something that have been with them since birth. Some of the things that impact people with intellectual disabilities, probably more than any other category of disability, is what we call infantilization. And this is treating people with intellectual disabilities as if they are permanent children. And a lot of that is, it comes from the fact that for a very long time, we would, in fact, still really in our society, talk about a person as the mental age of X, Y, or Z, right? So we would be talking about a 25-year-old woman and say that she has the mind of a 10-year-old. And this has really led to thinking of people with intellectual disabilities as being kind of permanent children. And one of the results of that is, and I think I touch upon this later as well, but while I'm on it, one of the results of that is that we deny people with intellectual disabilities information about healthy boundaries, about healthy sexuality, about healthy relationships, because we're assuming that they will never have those types of relationships. And this creates a significant risk factor for sexual and domestic violence. The category of disability most of us are most familiar with are physical disabilities. Again, physical disabilities can be present at birth. It can be something caused by even giving birth, like cerebral palsy. It could be something like muscular dystrophy, which is a congenital disability that impacts the strength of a person's muscles, or it can be an acquired disability through an accident or through illness. And then, of course, psychiatric disabilities, which I think within our field, probably the most experience that we have is with people who have psychiatric disabilities, either through trauma or because of their psychiatric disability, they have been put at risk of sexual and domestic violence. But psychiatric disabilities can be anything from severe depression to anxiety to bipolar disorder to schizophrenia. Even within that category itself, it's a huge, broad number of ways that that disability may present itself. And then finally, sensory disabilities are disabilities that impact any of the five senses. We are mostly talking about hearing and sight when we're talking about sensory disabilities. However, we were just having a conversation before we let you all in about COVID and how it can impact your senses of taste and smell. So there are illnesses or injuries that can ultimately impact your sense of taste, your sense of smell, in your sense of touch. But mostly we're talking about hearing and sight. One important caveat to keep in mind when we're thinking about sensory disabilities that impact hearing. There's not all people who have acquired hearing loss or who have hearing loss identify as having a disability. There's a large subset of people who actually identify as being a cultural and linguistic minority that is defined by the use of American Sign Language. So it's just a cultural minority minority, and they see themselves as big D deaf versus little d deaf. And so that is just an important thing to keep in mind, because when you are working with deaf survivors in the work that you're doing, it is not just a matter of providing language access. You also want to make sure you are providing culturally relevant services to the deaf community. I don't know if we mentioned this at the beginning. It may have been mentioned, but I may have zoned it out. But if you have questions for me during this, it would be great if you could put them in the Q&A pod, because the chat is already really, really active with all of you saying hello to each other and introducing yourselves. And I don't want to lose an important question. So if you have a question, please make sure you put it in the Q&A pod. I think it's important, as we're thinking about serving survivors with disabilities, to understand sort of the cultural and societal context that people with disabilities bring into our services. It's important to know that for a really long time, people with disabilities were really treated as if their disability was a curse from God, or that it was some sort of karmic retribution for bad behavior. And that really defined the experiences of people with disabilities for hundreds and hundreds of years, to the point where if a person gave birth to a child with a disability, there was an immediate reflex of putting that child into an institution setting. And so for many people with disabilities of a certain age, their early lives were spent in an institution. Over the years, that religious sort of moral model of treating people with disabilities shifted to more of a pity or charity model. If you think about, for instance, Jerry's Kids, those of us of a certain age may remember the commercials that would air showing kids with disabilities, and trying to really evoke a sense of like pity, so that people would be charitable and offer money around fixing the disability or addressing the barriers that kids with disabilities experience. One of the interesting things about sort of this model is that a lot of times, in order to evoke that sense of pity or charity, the main people featured in any sort of advertisements or campaigns around disability were children. And so this also has fed into people with disabilities generally being seen as permanent children. So as I mentioned in the earlier slide, people with intellectual disabilities are assigned this mental age, which causes them to be treated as permanent children. But then you have this sort of pity charity model that also is trying to evoke the people to feel sorry for people with disabilities, and who's more sympathetic than a kid with disabilities. And so it's mostly children who are featured, then further cementing in our culture's mind's eye that people with disabilities are forever children. And then the third way that our society has treated people with disabilities is through a medical model of disability. And within the medical model, disability is seen as something that should be fixed or cured. Many people with disabilities have extensive trauma associated with medicine and with the hospitals because of everything that they were put through growing up, trying to fix their disability, trying to cure their disability. A lot of people with autism also talk about sort of the ABA model of treating autism, which they now adults will, in reflecting upon it, experience that as abusive, yeah, because they were trying to that force the kids with autism to sort of comport to societal norms, there was a lot of restraint and sort of control of those kids in order to get them to behave in a way that was seen as the norm for society. So I in the chat, I know I said use the Q&A, but I'm wondering if in the chat you can spend a little bit of time reflecting on what is the overarching sort of story that is being told for each type of way that we have treated people with disabilities throughout history, whether it's thinking of disability being a curse from God, or that it's something that needs to be pitied or cherried, or something that needs to be fixed. What's the overarching message that you might be getting from these models? And we do have one person saying it's deficit based. Exactly. You'll hear a lot, especially within the medical model and the pity/charity model, of around loss. That it's not something positive at all. That disability is defined by having something less than. And I'm seeing a lot of this in the chat as well, that they are different. It others people with disabilities. It creates a stigma, and Rebecca is saying it's less than, right? And when you carry that around with you, that this being treated as if your personhood is something that needs to be fixed or cured or pitied, it does result in sort of a belief about yourself that your basic needs in order to participate in our society are burdensome. And this translates even into like our Americans with Disabilities Act. It talks about reasonable accommodations being provided that they are not an undue burden. And I like to sort of take this idea, this notion of people's access needs being something extra or special or different, and turn it on its head, because we all receive accommodations every single solitary day. The world is accommodating our access needs all of the time. If we were not primarily a sighted society, we wouldn't need lights in the evening time. We wouldn't have street lights. We wouldn't have shoe stores on every corner if we were mostly people who were using wheelchairs. All of these things that we consider as just like basics about our needs are not seen as extra or special or burdensome. But in what we have done with the models of disability and the way we've treated people with disabilities in our society is that we have reinforced this notion that anything a person with a disability needs is special, is extra, is burdensome. And people with disabilities carry that inside of them as well. They've experienced it. We just conducted a listening session on a project that I'm working on. And one of the people talked about how so the project that I'm working on is around addressing abuse by personal care attendants. And one of the people talked about how when she was able to hire her own personal care attendants as an adult, it was so freeing for her, because the way that her mother had treated those responsibilities had made her feel like such a burden, like that she was just too much, too extra. And so these are messages that get reinforced from not only society at large, but even within the family unit. So all of this is to sort of set the stage for you that we in this field of providing services around domestic and sexual violence, like we have a responsibility to be able to treat access needs as just standard ways of doing business. And so we'll talk a little bit more about how you can get there as well. Before I do that, I did want to paint a little picture of domestic and sexual violence in the lives of people with disabilities, because another thing that ableism has done really well is it has marginalized people with disabilities in our society. And so a lot of you may be out there thinking, gosh, I don't think I've worked with someone with a disability, maybe psychiatric disabilities, but I haven't really worked with people with intellectual disabilities in the course of my doing this work. And that's not because they're not experiencing domestic and sexual violence. It's because we have designed our programming to make it seem like our programs are not designed for people with disabilities. But in reality, people with disabilities experience really high rates of violence. From the limited research that has been conducted on this population, we know that women who have experienced intimate partner violence are more than twice as likely to also report having a disability. Men with disabilities experience much higher rates of sexual violence in their lifetime compared to men without disabilities. Nearly 50% of people with developmental disabilities experience assault 10 or more times in their lifetimes. And 20% of deaf adults have experienced physical abuse by an intimate partner, and 15% have experienced forced sex in an intimate partner relationship. So, in the course of doing work to address domestic and sexual violence, this is not an add-on population. This is a core population of people who are experiencing domestic and sexual violence and need our services, and that we need as a movement, as a field, to be prepared to be able to serve. It's also important to recognize that the way sexual and domestic violence manifests in the lives of people with disabilities, it's oftentimes not reflected in our program materials. So, for instance, for a lot of people with disabilities, their perpetrator is connected to them through their disability. They can be personal care attendants, as I mentioned just now. They could be drivers of accessible transportation. They could be someone who's working in rehabilitation therapy that is causing the harm. And yet our materials don't necessarily reflect that. We talk about boyfriends and past partners and acquaintances, but keeping in mind that because of infantilization, a lot of people with disabilities are never even taught that they might have a boyfriend or girlfriend or partner in the future. And so what's happening to them is happening because of a relationship they have to someone because of their disability. And not only is this a problem that those types of perpetrators are not reflected in our literature. What is another problem with all of this, with people experiencing harm by somebody who is connected to them because of their disability? What is a message that they might be receiving about that, given the high rates of victimization also that are happening? And you could type your thoughts in the chat. Question I'm asking, I've got a request to ask that again. But if you are experiencing harm because you've been connected to someone because of your disability, what might be a message that you internalize about the harm that you are experiencing? Deb is saying, I can't trust people, possibly. Unhealthy relationships become the baseline for you, is another response in here. I won't be believed. And yeah, Elena is saying the harm is because I'm disabled. And big message that a lot of people with disabilities carry around, that they are vulnerable. And this is even codified in our own mandatory reporting requirements, because we talk about mandatory reporting of abuse of vulnerable adults. And so a lot of people with disabilities have this core belief that they are vulnerable because of their disability. And yeah, that is a very slippery slope into this will never change. How can I change this without changing the fact that I have a disability? It's a slippery slope into it's my fault. If I didn't have this disability, this wouldn't be happening to me. And we, like I said, have even codified this in our language about like, talking about the person just inherently being vulnerable because they have a disability, versus the fact that our systems are what make them vulnerable. It's not because you have a disability that you are being harmed. It's because we as a society don't treat people with disabilities as being valuable enough to be able to pay people higher wages to care for you or to require more training to care for you. We don't care enough to do anything about somebody harming people with disabilities other than releasing them from employment. They can just pop on over to another disability employer and do the same things all over again. And so these are things that I think are really critical, because I know when I was doing direct services as an advocate for survivors, one of the hardest things to get through was that self-blame, was the idea that you're a magnet for abuse. I used to talk about like these were outposts in their heads, and the abuser could just plug into that outpost whenever they wanted to, and that is absolutely true for survivors with disabilities, is that they have this outpost in their head where there is this core belief that it's because of their disability that they are experiencing this violence. And so it's important, especially for direct service providers, to recognize that and to be able, as advocates and as people who support advocates, to be able to kind of critically discuss that with a survivor with a disability, to be able to hold up for survivors with disabilities all the ways our society makes them vulnerable. It's not the disability itself that makes them vulnerable, but society is creating those vulnerabilities by being inaccessible, by having very low standards for employment of people who are in really important roles in the lives of people with disabilities, all of that sort of stuff. And then the other ways that society makes people with disabilities vulnerable is everything I've talked about already, kind of the denial of information about healthy relationships. This is systematic across the board. We see people with disabilities who are just told that this is never, why would you get information about a healthy relationship if we think of you as a permanent 10-year-old. And so that, again, makes people incredibly, it creates an incredibly high risk for people with disabilities, because a couple of things happen when someone does show interest in you. It makes that exciting, and you're like, well, wow, someone actually does like wants to have a romantic relationship with me, but no one's taught you what a healthy romantic relationship should look like, and this person may have all the information and wield that power over you. But it also creates another vulnerability in the sense that if something is happening to you, but no one's given you the language to discuss it, you may not be able to effectively communicate what is happening, because no one's ever talked about healthy boundaries or consent in a sexual relationship with you, or what that consent might look like for you. And so it creates a barrier to you being able to reach out for help as well. And I'm seeing a couple of things in the chat. People are still sharing sort of what this could lead to in the mind's eye of a person with a disability. And one of them is like, I have to endure the abuse to get access to either care, medication, or the community. In other words, if I want to participate in society, this is just my lot in life. So thanks for sharing that. Please keep adding into the chat. I'm not going to read every one of them, but that one really stood out for me. Um, and then, all of what I've been talking about so far when it comes to understanding sort of the cultural and societal context surrounding people with disabilities, it really is just about systematic oppression of people with disabilities. People with disabilities are isolated from, oftentimes in special education or special Olympics, and they put into different places, not into our mainstream society. Oftentimes that isolation pushes people with disabilities into the margins of our society. And this really results in the ability to exploit people with disabilities with relative impunity. In fact, in most places in our country up until 2020, not 1920, but 2020, it was perfectly acceptable to pay people with disabilities pennies on the dollar for their labor. No living wage, no expectation of a minimum wage. Because they had a disability, employers were given a pass and basically said, if you employ this person, you can pay them well below the minimum wage, creating, of course, sort of a cycle of poverty for people with disabilities. And that cycle of poverty is further sort of uh, compounded by the fact that you can't make over a certain amount of money and still get your public benefits. Public benefits, by the way, that pay for your personal care attendants, your equipment if you need a wheelchair or other assistive equipment, your health care. So you can't make over a certain amount. And there's also a marriage penalty for people with disabilities. If they get married, they can lose their public benefits as well. So it just creates this cycle of poverty and further sort of it makes it impossible oftentimes for people with disabilities to escape a harmful, abusive relationship. In addition to those dynamics, there's the added dynamic of lack of confidentiality. And so for some communities, for instance, the deaf community, the communities are small and close knit, and even the ASL interpreters within those communities are, while they're hearing, they're very much a part of that small, close knit community, which can make it feel like if I go to a hearing service provider and they pull an American Sign Language interpreter in to provide me with communication access, that ASL interpreter could also be the person who interprets for my history classes or interprets at my church on Sundays. And it can feel, even if then the interpreter has the highest standards of ethics when it comes to what they're interpreting, and they would never violate confidentiality, it could make the person, the survivor, feel like they don't have confidentiality. For people with intellectual disabilities, and other disabilities as well, like significant mental health disabilities, you might have a replacement decision maker imposed on them by the courts. And that can result in a lack of confidentiality if the person starts to seek services for victimization. And then I mentioned already that in all 50 states, we do have mandatory reporting requirements for abuse of vulnerable adults. which can close down confidential avenues for adults who may not need a bureaucracy to come into their lives. They could potentially just ask for help, and in fact, oftentimes are just asking for help, but it results in a mandatory report that then invites a bureaucracy into their life that they didn't really ask for. Other layers for people with disabilities include being fearful of being institutionalized should they disclose that they have a disability or that they are experiencing victimization. And these are things that abusers often really leverage as a threat. Like, sure, go ahead, tell someone that I'm doing this to you. All that's going to happen is I'm going to get a slap on the wrist and they're going to put you in a nursing home. And this is borne out in real life experiences from people with disabilities who've had a mandatory report made on them. The investigators come in and decide that the person would be safer in a nursing home. And I know that, when I was working with survivors directly, one of the things that I always wanted to pay attention to is like, what was their primary emergency? A lot of times, for the survivors I was working with, their primary emergency, once they got into shelter, was no longer their abuser. And it was a matter of figuring out, okay, what is it that you need to settle right now before we start to address this other stuff? What are the things that need to be settled for you so that you can be present to address these other things going on in your life? For people with disabilities, that primary emergency might be that they are so afraid that they are going to lose their freedom, that they're going to lose their independence. And so it's important for advocates to recognize that that's a real fear that they may be sitting with. And it's part of the reason that later on I'll talk to you about some of the changes that you can make within your organization, include addressing and making very clear whether or not you're a mandatory reporter. A lot of times advocates are not mandatory reporters, and that's a good thing because you can set that aside. Hey, you can talk to me. This is a confidential space. We can talk through everything that is happening to you and make plans for your next steps without me having to tell anyone. But if you are a mandatory reporter, that's critical as well for you to figure out, because you don't want to invite someone to talk to you about these things without you being really clear that what can happen next. There may also be a fear or a threat of losing their personal care and other services. One of the strategies abusive people will use in the lives of people with disabilities is to become a relied upon caregiver. And so then if you start saying, hey, this is not okay with me. I don't appreciate you speaking to me like this, or doing these, like taking my money, or you've been really handsy when you're putting me to bed at night. That hurts. You start to speak up for yourself in those situations, then the person can be like, well, fine, I won't do this for you anymore. And then they'll just leave you without any personal care whatsoever. And so that's a real threat that is, again, borne out in lived experience. Another issue that comes up for people with disabilities, and this becomes really important when you are, for instance, doing safety planning with survivors with disabilities, is a lack of accessible transportation. In every single community that we've worked with in over 100 communities at this point across America, we've conducted a needs assessment in every single one, and in every single one of those needs assessment, the lack of accessible transportation is a significant issue for people with disabilities. That, to get to appointments, to get to work, to get to any of the things that you need in order to live an independent life, it's difficult because either accessible transportation is non-existent in that community, or it's very, very limited. Oftentimes, the accessible transportation that is available in communities are on a fixed route, which means that someone who is leaving an abusive relationship, the abuser will know exactly where the accessible transportation is going at any point just by looking at the fixed route that accessible transportation is on. This is why I said it's an issue when it comes to safety planning as well. So this is like a infrastructure issue that I think is we've got an uphill battle around this, but it is a serious issue in our society that there is not a lot of accessible transportation options. I just, this is, I think I'm going on and on about this because it just really hit personally for me. A good friend of mine, her husband, who had colon cancer, and it had resulted in him having to use a wheelchair. And that ultimately she lived right outside of Nashville, so she did not have access to the accessible transportation in Nashville. And the accessible transportation provider in her county that required her to make appointments 3 weeks in advance. And she was just like, I don't even get my doctor appointments for 2 weeks. Like it was an impossible situation for her. And then, we were looking at her using my van and making it into an more accessible, wheelchair accessible van. And it was going to cost like $70,000 to turn my $18,000 van into an accessible van. So it's like a serious issue that I think, need to come together and fix because particularly at this intersection, it creates all sorts of barriers to getting help. I've kind of went on about this already, but when you are denying information about healthy relationships, about unhealthy relationships, about what abusive behavior is, what isn't abusive, it really makes it difficult for someone to know that what they are experiencing is actually abuse or criminal behavior. They might think this is just, as we've seen in the chat already, this is my lot in life. This is what my trade-in is in order to get the supports that I need. I have to experience these sorts of things. And then we've also talked about the fact that they may have experienced violence throughout their lives by multiple perpetrators, which again reinforces this notion that they are a magnet for abuse, that their needs result in abusive people coming into their lives, and also just they have compounded trauma. They will have the compounded trauma of having experienced violence from multiple perpetrators throughout their lives. That in and of itself is trauma compounding on top of trauma, but then they also are living with the trauma of medical interventions that might have happened to them as children, or the trauma of being treated poorly by family members. For deaf people, one of the early traumas that they experience is language deprivation. Most deaf people are born to hearing families, and the hearing people in those families don't necessarily learn ASL or turn their homes into bilingual homes. And so the deaf kids grow up without access to information that the rest of the hearing people have. That's also a trauma that they're living with. And so working with that compounded trauma is also, it's something that advocates and counselors and therapists need to be prepared to address. And then, in addition to all of that, we also, our organizations have barriers within them. Disability organizations are often not equipped to address victimization. They're primary response to disclosures of victimization is mandatory reporting. It's not particularly trauma informed in the way they do those mandatory reports. And so there's a barrier to reporting to the place that the person may have the deepest, most long lasting relationship with, is that it's not a confidential place for them to report. Traditional victim service organizations are often inaccessible, not because of malice or bad intent, but because you're working with the resources that you have, and those resources are often donated. You're and you don't have the bandwidth to do a capital campaign to build a brand new universally designed building. And so those programs are often accessible. And your advocates, the service providers don't necessarily have the resources or training to meet the unique needs of people with disabilities. So there's barriers there. And within our related systems like criminal justice, APS, that's Adult Protective Services, um, there's often sort of this enduring narrative that people with disabilities aren't credible, that they are, the best way to help a person with a disability is just to get them into a more restricted environment, or there's more supports available to them. But that may not be what the person wants. And so all of the systems that are at play here in the lives of people with disabilities are problematic. And that's part of why we are here, and why OBW really emphasizes that their grantees are thinking about and trying to do work for people with disabilities. So what are some strategies for change? First and foremost, really looking at your services and figuring out how you might enhance those through your policies and procedures, but also through your staff training, through the resources that you offer. Though that's a real important starting point. It's also, your services are delivered often through your physical spaces. So it's an opportunity for you to really look at the accessibility of those spaces and make a plan for change. There's some things that will take years for you to be able to address if they're within your physical spaces. But there's also some things that is just a matter of moving around furniture to create a 36-inch pathway throughout your physical spaces. That can happen in a day. So it is worth it to actually look at your program and through a physical communication and policy lens of accessibility to figure out, okay, what can we change today? Can we change in a year? And what do we need to create a more planful change, a larger, longer term plan around, because it's going to take a lot longer. Building partnerships is an important step. I recommend that you date some disability organizations in your communities, get to know them, get to understand sort of how they deliver services, what their relationship is to opening up their services to you, talking to their program participants about domestic and sexual violence. Kind of get to know the disability organizations, and then really figure out which ones you want to have a longer term relationship with, because those disability organizations can be incredibly helpful for you if you need to get emergency equipment for somebody, if their abuser has broken, for instance, their wheelchair or other assistive technology. It can help you identify emergency personal care attendants that you can rely on if someone needs to come in but needs those personal care attendant services in order to be part of your programming. So really working on building those partnerships. And then you're doing what you can in your community to raise awareness about this issue, and foster accountability. Learn about, just the responsibilities of organizations to provide accommodations and advocate for those accommodations, not as special or burdens, but as just the range of access needs that human beings have. Really figuring out, for instance, if you do any sort of legal advocacy, figuring out whether there's an ADA coordinator at your courthouse, get to know that person and figure out sort of how far in advance do you need to request accommodations if that comes about. Thinking about any work that you do in the prevention realm, ensuring that you're incorporating the lived experiences of people with disabilities into that prevention work. If you're going into schools, asking whether or not the kids with disabilities are going to be allowed to participate in your trainings and advocating for that as well. And then, of course, I've mentioned already that the research that we have out there is really limited. So for any of you who are researchers or doing evaluation, you know, uh, figure out if this is something that you would like to learn more about, because there is really not enough information out there. And most of what we know is from directly from people with disabilities, which is really and the important stuff, right? And it's what guides how we talk about this and the recommendations that we make. But without those sort of more empirical scientific numbers, it's hard to move policy. It's hard to move policymakers. It's hard to get more funding directed towards this issue. So we really do need to increase research and evaluation as well. Just wanted to walk you through some of the tools that we offer around each of these things. We have a system built into our end abuse. I'm going to type this into the chat. Our End Abuse website you can register for an account. And on our End Abuse website, we have a bunch of trainings and tools. One of the tools that we have is our performance indicator measurement system. And this is a really good place for you to start to identify sort of, okay, where are we doing okay? Where are we doing pretty well? And where do we need to really invest in our own capacity around serving survivors with disabilities? We have tools, the performance indicator measurement system was designed around domestic violence programs that have shelters, domestic violence programs that don't have shelters, sexual assault programs, and dual domestic and sexual violence programs. And then there's also a set of indicators for disability organizations and a set of indicators for hearing organizations that want to better serve deaf survivors. It's a really good place to start to get a snapshot of how you're doing in this particular area, and it's completely free. We also recommend that you're paying attention to policies and procedures that are like really specific to survivors with disabilities, including your mandatory reporting policy, policies around working with somebody who has a guardian, representative payees. This is particularly if you're working with someone who's experienced financial abuse, the representative payee system is one that is often exploited, and with it's kind of easy to exploit. So like having policies in place around that as well. And then importantly, making sure that you have an accommodations policy, and that policy lays out how to get accommodations and your organization's expectation about what is a reasonable time frame. And I would say a reasonable time frame is less than 12 hours, because I don't know about you, but if I were to show up in a crisis and need support, I wouldn't want to wait 3 days to be able to talk to somebody for the first time. So really looking at your accommodations policy to make sure that it is emphasizing the needs of the survivors and not, making it easier on your organization. We also have resources for online, same end of use, pwd.org website, that are trainings designed specifically for direct service providers. And there's 3 courses that I would recommend. One is on building accessible and safe services through your policies and procedures. We walk you through some of the key things that you would want to include in each of these policies that I just addressed. There's a course on assessing your organization for physical access and safety. So basically, how do I conduct an access review of my organization? And then accounting for access in your program materials. So making sure that your intake materials are accessible to people, all of the materials that you hand out to survivors, that they're accessible to people. And these are all free courses, and they're online courses, so you could take them whenever you have a little extra time. As far as building partnerships, there's a handful of resources that I'm linking to here. One is our Supporting Crime Victims with Disabilities from Crisis to Healing. We actually have in that resource a decision tree. So if you're working with a survivor and that survivor is in need of medical equipment, the decision tree kind of helps you get to the types of organizations that can help you get that particular resource. And then there's also a it's a small little tip sheet around collaboration and key considerations for collaborating with disability organizations, building strong collaborations, what you need in place, all of that. As far as fostering accountability and raising awareness, we offer monthly webinars through our End of Use of People with Disabilities webinar series. Our webinar this month is on January 21st. And it is focused on stalking in the lives of people with disabilities, but we offer these every month on Tuesdays. And it's usually the 3rd Tuesday or the 4th Tuesday. It changes from year to year. I have to look at what it is this year, but you can find that also on our End of Use website. And then you can also sign up for to be on our mailing list, and you'll automatically get notifications as registration opens for these. And then I mentioned advocating for accommodations as well. We have a resource on our website. It's called the Just Ask Toolkit, and there's a toolkit for advocates, a toolkit for law enforcement, and a toolkit for attorneys and prosecutors. So if you're interested in that, you can go on our website and download those as well. If you want hard copies, so like if you're really motivated after this and you're just like, I'm on a crusade, Sandra, email me and I'll get hard copies of our toolkits sent to you at no charge to you. We have a lot of those hard copies, and we're happy to unload them. So if you are interested, send me an email and I'll get some out to you. Speaking of, we do provide direct technical assistance. So say you you get a call on the crisis line tonight, and you know that you're going to be working with somebody who has an intellectual disability, and you just want to talk through particular resources. You can email me directly. I wouldn't recommend it. I have a lot of unread emails in my inbox right now, but hopefully 2025, this is going to get much better because I do now have an assistant. But you can also reach out at hello@activatingchange.org, or you can put in a request for TA at this link. I'm going to get that for you right now. I think filling out the link is your best bet because our incredible access coordinator is the person who is monitoring this link. And so if you put in a request at this link, you're going to get a response pretty quickly. And I'm putting this into the chat right now. And I do see in the chat something that I think is really important to lift up. Aparna, I hope I'm saying that right, is saying my concerns would be limitations to resources based on immigration status of the survivor. Some states, especially in the South, might not have the safety nets for undocumented or folks who are not citizens. You're absolutely right around all of that. And most disability organizations have as one of their core values, Aparna, that they will serve anyone. It doesn't matter. And so they can still help you get some of those resources without having to go through like our systems, like our legal systems. They can help get assistive equipment and auxiliary aids because they have it as one of their core values that they will serve everyone. That is not to say it would be easy. And I would say just generally, like any sort of state-based care, anything that's coming through our benefits system, it's hard for documented folks who've lived here. Like there are people who've been on a waiting list for a personal care attendant for 10 years. And so it is not easy generally to have a disability and get your needs met. And I would recommend that more than ever to really start building some partnerships with disability programs. So, because I don't know that they'll be able to immediately solve this problem, but I think it's only through those partnerships that we can come up with some solutions that can kind of bypass these state-based care systems that are out there and come up with more innovative solutions because we put our heads together around that. I do see there are two questions. Deb, you said, could you please post those links in the chat? Could you say more about which links you're meaning? And someone else is saying they'd love to bring this training to their organization. A great way to do that is to complete the form that I posted in the chat, Michelle. If you do that, Sid will follow up with you pretty quickly. You can also email me directly, as I mentioned. And like I said, I have hired an amazing assistant, so you might get back to me, or you might hear back from me a lot faster because Janice is part of my life now. So there we are. Any other questions? And if not, I think I'm going to be able to give y'all back the gift of time today, which is always fun.
Hi, can you guys see me or no?
I don't see you, Neelam.
No, I never know what's going on with my computer. Anyways, I just want to say thank you, Sandra, so much for a wonderful presentation. Definitely please access Activating Change if you need any TA services or training. They're wonderful. And I hope you all have a wonderful rest of the day. And again, thank you, Sandra. And for their next office wide webinar, is on Monday next week, and we will have the Asian Pacific Institute on Gender-Based Violence presenting on their resource center that is for all grantees on Interpretation and Translation Resource Center. So you all have a great evening and have a nice weekend, and see you next week. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye, everybody. See you on Monday.